to the next presentation. Sorry. Thank you, Luis Jaime. Thank you all for the conversation. And please, Gary.
Yeah, thank you.
Let us share with us more questions.
Thank you, Paulo. I've been asked to, rather than give a presentation, to comment today on the presentation so far, and more generally, to propose some questions going forward, considering that this seminar is only the first of many. I hope that some of the points I make are not too redundant, or that they do not repeat anything said by our Belgian colleagues, since my understanding of French is a bit limited. In any case, I will try to be brief. I suppose the first distinction that we can make when approaching the topic of physical and digital models is between types of knowledge. On the one hand, I think we can speak of design knowledge or disciplinary knowledge, which includes, all of those principles, rules, ideas, methods, and habits that define our field as a discipline. And here I'm not only referring to architecture, but also archaeology. And on the other hand, there's instrumental or operative knowledge, which refers to the ability to use tools, software, machines, instruments within our field. I think that when we speak of architectural or archaeological knowledge, we're essentially speaking about a combination or the combination of these two types of knowledge. Since one can't really live without the other, and they are in constant tension and dialogue. We could even say that it is this tension precisely that defines the disciplinary evolution and boundaries of our field. And I'm reminded of the inscription in Brunelleschi's grave, that said, and I quote, "How Filippo, the architect, excelled in invention is shown not only by the beautiful shell of his famous temple, but also by the various machines that he invented with divine genius." End quote. So the dome could not have existed without the crane and the hoist, but more importantly, it could not have been designed without certain tools that made it possible, including the model, as mentioned by John this morning. And so we can speak about the model, yes, as a blunt tool, as part of an arsenal of things that allow us to represent the world or project something onto it. But it seems that we can also speak of it as a method that has defined our design knowledge throughout history. And I think this is where the relationship becomes a bit murkier. It's hard to speak, say, about the advancement of architecture in the 19th century without referring to the drawing tools and machines that were invented to draw curves, for example. And this brings me to another concept that I think might be useful in our discussion going forward, and that's the idea of encapsulated knowledge. The extent to which tools, including models, internalize some aspect of design knowledge that we no longer have to think about when we design or project. Every time we build something in AutoCAD, we're using calculus without doing calculus. Parametric tools like Grasshopper, for example, are particularly helpful because they offer user-friendly ways of manipulating the encapsulated aspects of our tools. And this in itself implies a bit more understanding of things like calculus matrices, and so on. So one could say that we are returning, or we constantly return to the basics in order to further our fields. And that we must continue to return to these fields that have been so encapsulated that they're no longer legible. I was also thinking while Luis Jaime was presenting that of an implicit paradox in a factory or a Taylorist model of production. There was never anything as a seamless factory line. So each machine required a massive amount of tinkering, and no two machines behave the same way. So each machine operator became a sort of world expert in operating his own machine. This kind of knowledge could not easily be easily transferred because it required hours and hours of practical experience. So Sami was talking about all of the hours and trial and error that went into operating these drones. And so when a machine operator was transferred from one post to another, the whole factory line would come to a halt. No, I think we're a long way from that, obviously, but our machines and models are slightly more predictable and precise. But as Luis Jaime described when talking about drone 3D surveys, the point still holds. No. The second distinction I'd like to make today, and it's already been referred to in some of the presentations, is the difference between the model as a descriptive form and the model as a projective form. No? I think the Sondondo models are a source of fascination precisely because they represent the tension and interplay between these two types of form. You know, that dialectical relationship between passive and active objects. No, the model as a symbolic representation versus the model as a generative or useful tool. No, in this case, it's neither one or the other, but maybe it's both, or maybe not. No, and of course, there's always a gray area. No, a model can be at once symbolic, metonymic, indexical, you know, describing something that exists outside of it. And it can be projective or speculative, allowing us to say something or do something to the thing being described. No? There's also the pedagogical aspect of modeling, which is a whole discussion in and of itself. No? To what degrees do models reveal or hide something about the world? No? Here I was thinking of the first models developed to describe the US economy, for example, and these were actually physical models. One of the first models created was a Philips Newland hydraulic machine, and it was developed in the early 20th century as a hydraulic analog to the US economy, you know, describing how money, or in this case water, you know, flowed through a series of tubes and valves, and how different inputs could lead to different outputs. No, and so in this case, the model was both a machine and a maquette. No, it represented something, but it also allowed us to project scenarios and ask questions that could be answered by the model. In that sense, it was, you know, when Andrew was talking about the libations and the flow of water, it's a kind of boring version of the Sayhuite stone. No? Of course, as economic models became more and more complex and therefore less legible, their pedagogical function was lost. No? Their opacity became part of their use. So in a way, they became useful as a way of hiding information behind expertise or complexity. No? And I guess what I'm driving at here is that the question of transparency versus opacity in model making. No? To what degree do models extend knowledge, and to what degree do they foreclose knowledge? No? When does information become too much information? When does the representation of information work against its legibility? And when does the representation of reality become too real or too abstract to be practical or conceptually sound? Here I'm thinking of Andrew's reduced scale object, but also some of the questions posed earlier, I think on Tuesday, by Yves with respect to 3D mapping technologies. No? So it seems we still tend to think of data as something that we layer or add onto the world, when in fact the removal of data is probably more important in building our understanding of it. No? There is no clear cutoff line, I think, between some information and too much information. But I guess the distinction must be constantly be made over and over again between information and knowledge. when does one threaten or help the other? When does the useful become actually useless? When does noise overtake signal? No, and I'd say there's no litmus test here, and the process is one of trial and error and constant tinkering. But clearly, synthesis does not imply simplification, no, and even if we're always at the risk of compounding the two. To finish, I think the Gregory Bateson's definition of information might be useful. He would describe information as a difference which makes a difference, no? And I think that works as a reminder that we should always be vigilant and never allow models to homogenize our understanding of the world, no? Yeah, and I think that's all I have to add at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary.
Je peux dire quelque chose?
Oui, bien sûr.
Excuse-moi, Gary, de le faire en français, mais c'est la seule manière pour moi. Ce que tu dis à propos de ce qui est montré, de ce qui est caché, de ce qui est filtré par le modèle, dans un sens ou dans un autre, que ce soit le modèle qui interprète et représente, ou le modèle génératif, comme tu le disais, il me semble que dans les deux cas, le modèle contribue à simplifier ce qui, sans son secours, serait trop complexe ou trop difficile à appréhender. On pourrait faire une comparaison avec le domaine de la philosophie, Platon, Aristote, le menuisier fait des tables, il y a le modèle de la table qui, d'une certaine façon, a la capacité à représenter toutes les tables, à les simplifier en créant une espèce de modèle qui n'existe pas, sauf de manière supposée, et en même temps d'être le modèle génératif sur lequel on va s'appuyer pour construire une table singulière, particulière. Et donc, est-ce qu'on ne rejoint pas là une discussion finalement assez générale et qui ne touche pas uniquement à la question du modèle physique ou numérique? Quoique, ici, tu parlais d'information, le propre du numérique, on en parlait avant-hier, c'est Paulo qui pointait ça, c'est que dans un nuage de points numériques, un point peut contenir bien d'autres informations que des positionnements dans l'espace. Et d'ailleurs, cet enregistrement, on va dire, de bruit, d'information, mais ce qu'on a regardé, ce que nous a montré tout à l'heure Louis Graham, mais ça suppose de rabattre, de réduire ces informations à travers un spectre d'analyse qui finit par rejoindre l'organisation de notre système perceptif visuel, qui est finalement, au bout du compte, perspectiviste, qui est aussi une façon de réduire complètement, je dirais, l'afflux des informations, l'afflux des perceptions qui peuvent être les nôtres. J'ai montré tout à l'heure en Sardaigne, des constructions simplifiées dans des maquettes. C'est un petit peu la même chose. Ces architectures, il y en a des milliers en Sardaigne, elles sont toutes singulières. Mais à l'intérieur de ces architectures qui sont toutes singulières, on trouve les représentations, des modèles qui sont simplifiés et qui sont les mêmes, et qui se répètent, eux, de manière quasiment identique, alors que leurs incarnations, leurs réalisations singulières sont très, très, très différentes, très concrètement, les unes des autres. Et donc, je ne suis pas sûr que la problématique renouvelée qu'amène la discussion sur les modèles numériques change fondamentalement la donne des logiques en cause. Évidemment, elles changent de nature, mais fondamentalement, je me demande si elles sont si différentes que cela. Je ne sais pas si tu as compris ce que j'ai essayé de dire. ou un petit peu.
Gary, one of the things I really liked about your presentation was highlighting the role of information and its relationship to data, and when is it meaningful. And I think that what's been interesting, Jean, about your presentation all the way to Luis Jaime's is seeing the role of technology. For some of our sort of simpler models that we've seen, I think it's easy for us from our vantage point and our technologies to look at it and say, oh, well, it must have been spiritual or symbolic. And then looking at something like Luis Jaime's models, we can very quickly be like, oh, wow, that's data. There's so much data there. But I think back then to, late 19th century site plans of Saxe-Aumont and how little information is in them compared to what Luis Jaime has achieved, and can think, oh, well, looking back on this, eventually we can think, oh, that wasn't a technical or a data-driven model. It was just a gestural sort of depiction of Saxe-Aumont. But of course, there was the limitation at that time of what technologically they could achieve. And sort of without the sort of firsthand experience of technology moving forward, sort of looking at it in hindsight, it can be difficult to add that in to your understanding of an object. So I'm just thinking, back to my question of what the models that Betanzos described as Pachacuti having used to create that rebuilding of Cusco, what would be the threshold of information at that time with the technologies that they were using that we would actually expect that object to look like. So it's just interesting to think of just that other aspect of temporality in the sort of the advancement of technology and how that causes us potentially to think of these objects differently.
Yeah, and I think there's an additional point that could be made about, how so-called models can be revelatory, right? Like they can reveal something about, in the case of Sawite, maybe the landscape surrounding it. But I think going back to what Luis Jaime was saying before we started the second session, they can also reveal something about the stone itself, right? And how there's it has a kind of sculptural component to it, no? Or intention. And so I think it's dangerous to always tether the idea of a model to the idea of a use, it's clear that we're not doing that, but I think the material substrate, or the let's say the support, what it's made of, is as important as what it's trying to convey.
Thinking about the question of Betanzos and Hamilton, the Hamilton-Betanzos question, on how this model could have looked like. I remember in the, the first years of the faculty, Jean-Pierre Protzen make a beautiful presentation on Inca architecture. And he highlighted how different Tiahuanacu and Inca architecture is in relation to geometry and precision. No, how non-important is for Inca architecture the precision of the number or the precision of the angle, and how much it is important for Tiahuanacu's. No? And he kind of say, I don't know if he actually said that, or I just wanted to understand what he said, but he pointed out that maybe in Inca architecture is an architecture that can be told in. Is a room of 3 by 2 niches, for instance, and he proposed that was maybe a way of instructing the making of architecture. A very, and I think how possible it is to do that when there is a strong tradition. Actually, Inca architecture it's maybe the simpler I know in complex cultures, in the quantity of elements or the complexity of the elements, and that made me think now about maybe it could have been really simple objects if you can read it that way, or maybe if you can read it as quipus in the way that you need a certain transmission of someone talking on the object itself. It's never. I think the object is never independent of someone saying something with the object. No, I don't know. Sorry, please hide me.
Let me change the focus a little bit, because I have been lately very interested in the notion of the individual behind the work, and individuality and exceptionality. I mean, Joanne Pillsbury asked me to write an article for an exhibition that she put together in the Met, and I wrote an article called Masters of the Universe. And it tried to explain the exceptional quality of certain craftsmen and women in the early Moche period in the Jequetepeque Valley. See, and let me go very fast about this. That period of time is exceptional. I mean, these guys developed fantastic metallurgy and fantastic ceramics out of nothing. There was nothing there, really. I mean, anything previous was not comparable, and then suddenly they are doing this type of thing. But they invent two things that are interesting. They very much invent what we call gilded metal. I mean, copper covered by a surface of gold that looks like gold. But at the same time, they invent slip ceramics, and that is ceramics that is covered by a surface, a substance. I mean, we call it engobe, that actually completely completely hides, the real color of the ceramics, and usually varnishes it with a white surface. These are two comparable techniques, and they were most likely developed by a very small set of individuals, you see. And when we look at ancient civilizations, we tend to think of them as socialist utopias, where things are developed by the consensus of society, and that's not the case. And I wonder how, if you guys, most of you are architects, are not thinking about these things, because you know that exceptional architecture is only possible if you have exceptional architects. You see, and when we compare, for instance, I had a student doing a master's dissertation comparing 3 Wari sites: Wari in Ayacucho, a place called Piracochapampa, in the highlands of Trujillo, and Marcahuamachuco, and also Piquillacta. And it's very clear that one individual was in charge. This guy was super clever, and he developed certain designs. He developed a way of building walls with a fish-like connection. And this is one of the things that we can do if we had good data. In the past, we couldn't do that because we didn't have good data. But now we can get good data, and we can start comparing them. So, for instance, think about it. The whole Sacred Valley, and particularly the end of the Sacred Valley ending in Machu Picchu, is seen by traditional Inca archaeology as a sacred landscape full of shrines and full of administrative structures. And I don't think it's the case. I think that the Sacred Valley was basically a place where rich families established rich states, a little bit like the Loire Valley of the Inca. And you have these 20 sites that are beautiful palaces, most of which require the building of step structures so that you have a platform on top of which you build the palace. So all of these sites that we have been mapping are like that, no? And I'm pretty sure that there's the hand of one gifted architect behind all this. You see, that this development had one individual, well, an exceptional individual behind that. No? So many things that we think in terms of social phenomena are not social in the sense that they were not produced by a social impetus, but they are actually, something that was produced by exceptional individuals being able to develop exceptional things before. The Inca are like that. The Inca before Sinchi Roca, I think, Inca architecture is nada. And then you have these wonderful things that are going on. So I think that we need to focus a little bit on that. I'm puzzled about the possibility that these gifted individuals had an impact in society. So if we go back to the Jequetepeque Valley, the people that created that ceramics that we find there are not like a social problem. They were not the evolution of art, the evolution of form. It's one guy that suddenly appears and bing, And exactly the same thing happens in Nazca. You see, the Nazca lines that are so famous in the world, I am sure now, after working there for a while, that they were all produced by one artist. You see? I mean, the Nazca did these geometric forms before and after. And the Nazca lines, the figures that we see of monkeys and hummingbirds, are all trapped in the middle. How do we know that? Because they superimpose ancient, older geometrical figures, and some geometrical figures superimpose on top of them. So they're in the middle of the Nazca time. That's when they happen, and all of them were designed in the same way, a continuous line. You see, if you start in one point in the hummingbird and you follow the line, you end up in the same point. If you follow the monkey, you do the same. The spider, you do the same. See, so it's something unique. I mean, not everybody has to design that way. There's no reason and there's no precedent, because before you have only geometric designs. And then this guy comes up, develop this technique, and it's really gifted. The problem is that when he dies, this technique, this art, this capacity to render the complexity of an animal with a simple line dies with him.
Pas sûr d'avoir tout... Pas sûr d'avoir tout... Non, je suis pas sûr d'avoir tout compris. Si tu nous invites à adopter une espèce de sociologie de l'élite, si on prend quelqu'un comme Palladio, par exemple, architecte de la Renaissance, on peut lui attribuer effectivement quelques mises en œuvre de l'architecture très singulières, qui ont fait beaucoup de petits, mais lui-même n'était pas pensable sans des prédécesseurs importants depuis plus d'un siècle à la Renaissance. Alberti, par exemple, on voit plus loin, Vitruve. Sans ça, Palladio, voilà, il n'aurait pas pu être celui qu'il a été. Et puis Palladio, outre les effets de ses conceptions dans la région qui était la sienne, on sait ce qui s'est passé après dans le nord de l'Europe, en Angleterre, et puis de l'autre côté de l'océan Atlantique. Voilà. Donc, il y a effectivement, il faut bien que des inventions passent par un sujet ou plusieurs sujets dans des situations privilégiées, qui ne sont pas nécessairement des situations de privilèges sociaux, parce que Palladio n'est pas un aristocrate, mais il a par contre été accueilli de manière bienveillante par des aristocrates. Donc, je pense que les mécanismes de mise au point du dispositif culturel, c'est quand même quelque chose d'assez complexe. Réduire ça à des traits de génie singuliers qui apparaissent et qui après disparaissent, voilà, je trouve que nous ne sommes pas très bien placés, en tout cas à partir de nos disciplines respectives, architectes ou archéologues, pour spéculer sur les modalités sociales d'émergence des inventions. Silencio.
Silencio, silencio. See, let me show you a couple of figures and let me see if, when I think of these fellows, I'm thinking in these. In a very short period of time, these things were done. This is what was done. Before, nothing, and then suddenly, boom. Yeah. The Señora de Cao, for instance, had this incredible dual metal object. Technically, they are a masterpiece. You see, combining gold and silver is not easy, and gilding the way they do it is magic. Actually, it's like real magic. You see, before we didn't have anything, and then suddenly all of this. It's a very short period of time. Yeah, it's a very short period of time where they can craft things like this, and then they simply run out of the possibility of doing that stuff. And I wonder if architecture works in the same way. I mean, there's no formal education in architecture. People that design buildings have to have some kind of training, some kind of predisposition. You know? And if you think about it, they could not have been simply members. This is not a gifted maestro de obras, no? Maître d'œuvre, I guess. No? This is not simply you see, a mason. It's people that develop these type of things have to be slightly different. So I'm wondering if this is an important question. You know? Of course, it goes against a lot of tenets in archaeology, but I think it's there.
You're becoming an art historian, Luis Jaime.
Am I?
You're becoming an art historian. The master.
Qué miedo.
Well, I suggest to stop now and reprendre les discussions demain et nous préparer pour la deuxième partie de demain vendredi pour justement, je crois que ce qui vient de présenter Gary, certaines questions qui ont apparu aujourd'hui pourront nous aider à justement envisager quelques idées, quelques lignes de projection pour les rencontres suivantes qui vont suivre. Donc, merci beaucoup Jean, spécialement Jean, Andrew, Luis Jaime and Gary. And see you tomorrow.
Merci à tout le monde.
Thank you.
Merci.
Merci,
Ciao, ciao.
Jean, Paolo.
Bonne journée, bonne soirée, c'est long.
Bye.